Well, certainly we're all tired of hearing today about the troubles in the recessionary times we live in. And yet a gentleman called Harry Shutt actually predicted this with a publication called The Trouble with Capitalism. Harry, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
In your book, certainly, and there's a heck of a lot of food for thought in this book. It'll take a bit of reading and a bit of absorption, but I would certainly recommend it. But within the book, as I took it, your essential message was, this crash is not a blip. It is a fundamental crossroads in the way society leads itself for the betterment of the people, and that the current model of capitalism as we know it is dead.
Well, I think the fundamental point I want to get across should come across from the book is that really the crisis which we're now facing is a culmination of decades of failure of the system under what one would call the conditions of an extended business cycle. I mean, the business cycle has been part of world capitalism since over 200 years or longer, and it essentially means that you are you're confronted with a situation whereby excess capacity grows, and it has to be shaken out eventually, and that is why you get stock market crashes and economic downturns, which tend to lead to enormous numbers of people losing their jobs and suffering loss of income and deprivation, and this was thought by many, and I would agree with this. It was thought by many to have been a major cause of World War II, insofar as you had the major crash in 1929-31, which brought about mass unemployment all across the industrialized world.
Indeed.
And it provoked the conditions which led to World War II. And that was what we really said, our leaders said after World War II, never again. We mustn't allow this to happen. But in fact they have.
Okay, and you would put that down to this mantra of maximising profit at the detriment of everything else in society under the capitalist kind of ruling.
Yes, well, I mean, this is the inevitable trend of capitalism. I don't blame capitalists for doing this. I mean, that's what they're there for. I mean, you see, under company law, which, I mean, I think the sort of British Victorian model is the basis for what's happened around the world, that you have a company law which requires corporations and joint stock companies to maximize their profits in the interests of shareholders. Now, you get a lot of talk from people about corporate social responsibility and how people must respect the workforce and the society in general, the environment, and pay lip service. Sorry, let me say, pay as far as possible due respect to the interests of different stakeholders, as they're called. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the crunch, when the chips are down, it's the shareholders who have to be given priority, and that's what ultimately causes the thing to break down.
Absolutely, but I mean, prior to this crash, those major successful corporate entities were held in the very highest esteem. It seemed to be the place where everybody aspired to get to.
Yes, well, if I may say so, without attacking the media, which you represent unduly, this is a reflection of the fact that people get their ideas from various media, the press and the broadcast media, and these tend to be controlled on the whole, and that even applies to state-sponsored agencies like in our country, the BBC. The weight of opinion expressed there is that free markets and the operation of the capitalist system tends to be benign, and the leaders of that system tend to be worshipped. I mean, they're not as greatly now, of course, as they were back in the 80s, but then there was quite astounding adulation of these people 20 years ago.
But at the end of the day, I mean, I would agree totally with you in the sense that shareholder value and maximising profits for shareholders was the mantra. But in a way, weren't we all shareholders in the sense that most pensions had their values intrinsically tied with the corporates of this world?
Well, indeed, and that's precisely the trouble. I mean, now we are seeing in the UK and in the United States also, and I dare say in Ireland too. I don't know the extent of the structure of the Irish pension funds.
Pretty similar, I would suggest.
Sorry?
Pretty similar lines, I would
suggest.
Right,
yes. Well, I mean, we were tied into this through a system which essentially compelled us, because the tax breaks were given, more or less compelled us to join pensions schemes, which tied our retirement income to their fortunes. Now, I would argue that, of course, that seemed to work very well for a long period when the stock market boom was going on.
Sure.
In the last 10 years or so, when it's been markets have been either crashing or moving sideways, this has turned to disaster. And of course, the conclusion I would draw from that is that we should never have allowed this to happen.
Okay, but I suppose the counter to that, perhaps, Harry, is that always the professionals in the pension schemes will say, look, you should expect an average growth of 6-7%. There will be highs, there will be lows. And they, of course, will preach that, look, we're going through the bottom of the cycle now. It will recover. But let that be to one side. Let that be their mantra. What is your alternative going forward in your view, in your analysis of the place we found ourselves?
In my analysis, I think the private corporate sector has to be more heavily regulated, to say the least, and in particular, bearing in mind that we, as a society, as citizens, as taxpayers, we support and protect the private corporate sector. But to the extent that we do, they should be much more accountable to us. Now, there's a fairly basic principle involved here, which is that of limited liability. Now, limited liability, and I say something about this in the book, this is a concept, again, which was really generalized by the companies' legislation brought in the UK in the Victorian era, which essentially says that if you are a shareholder, you're only liable for the failure of a company or its misdeeds up to the level of the amount you've invested. In other words, you can't be held liable for more than you... If the company goes bust, you lose the money you put into it, but you're not liable for any other crimes it might have committed. Now, this, in fact, gives tremendous license and is a tremendous privilege, really, and there's been a cover for all sorts of fraud and crimes over the years. And it will it needs to be countered now by saying, well, if you have limited liability, or indeed if you receive any other protection from the state in the form of subsidies or tax breaks, in principle you have to answer to the collective, to the community, and not just to the shareholders.
Well, I suppose, Harry, in a sense, particularly in the Irish context, we're seeing that written on the walls everywhere now, where government are belatedly but sitting back and sitting up and saying we cannot run the system as it was, and such accountability is certainly more to the fore than ever. And I suggest that if they want some more instruction, they might take up your publication and have a read of it, and perhaps we can come back to you and talk to you about it at another stage.
Well, I hope they will. I mean, I could only be too delighted if Ireland was to prove a laboratory for some of my ideas, because right now, I mean, I have to tell you that in the UK, the City of London has a very dominant influence over our economy and over the political decision-taking. That is very far from being the agenda. Well, I say it's very far, although lately the chairman of the Financial Services Authority has actually, amazingly, you may have heard about this, come out and said he thinks the financial sector is too bloated and parts of it are even socially useless. I quote him on that.
Indeed. Well, look, Harry, we'd certainly like to come back again, as I say, maybe later and talk to you more about this excellent publication. It's called The Trouble with Capitalism, and its author, Harry Shutt. I'm delighted to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your programme.